what seems to be going on pretty reliably so far is finding relationships of complementarity and mutual correction rather than adversarial processing, right? The attempt to dominate or destroy.
Right.
That I think for me, not only what we're talking about, but the exemplification of how we're talking and how we're entering into a relationship, how we're reprioritizing. We're moving off of the product and the position and trying to really move into process and participation. And that's always been very important to me because, as you know, I aspire towards the Socratic ideal, but that is now even more so the case for me because I see that ability to enact functional as opposed to dysfunctional and adaptive as opposed to maladaptive collective intelligence and bring it into something like collective rationality so that we can effectively aspire to collective rationality and wisdom. That has become very, very central to me. And so the process of all this discussion over the last year, meeting all of you guys and women, and then engaging in the work on the After Socrates project has intensified and very dramatically deepened. It was already deep, I believe, but has intensified and dramatically deepened my commitment to the Socratic ideal of dialogos. That has now become sort of very, very, I would say that's sacred to me in the way I talk about in this series.
Right. Okay. You've already you've already touched on some of the things that we were going to discuss.
Sure.
The first being rationality. And so you said collective rationality.
Yeah.
So that seemed to be an interesting idea. And dialogos. So what's the difference between just ordinary rationality and let's say collective rationality and dialogue and dialogos?
Right. So let's do it first. What's the difference between sort of ordinary or the common notion of rationality and the notion I'm arguing for, and then we'll do that sort of individually because that will give me an analogic basis for them talking about the collective. Is that okay? Does that make sense?
Sure. Great. Yeah.
So typically, and I know this because I teach on rationality, and so I get to see and these are bright, educated young people. They're right, and so they're sort of the best representative of what we call folk psychology. So within the cog-sci academic world, folk psychology is the largely implicit psychological theories that most people are carrying around. So people have implicit theories about intelligence, about rationality.
That's great.
Right. And it's folk psychology. They have implicit theories about how memory works. They have implicit theories about what concepts are. Now, one thing we should put on the table right away is, and this is what I spent a lot of time doing in Introduction to Cog-Sci, is most of those folk psychological intuitions have turned out to be wrong. They have turned out to be very wrong, and for a kind of important reason.
Right. So let's say our ideas about rationality, our ideas about wisdom, our ideas about intelligence. All of them are very distorted or very
very skewed. Ideas about memory. Let me give you an example for memory because it's far enough away from our topic that'll be a little less controversial, a little easier to just sort of establish. So many people, we have all these metaphors, in fact, that bespeak this. We think of memory as like a room in which we store things, and we go in there and we retrieve it and we search through our memory. And so the metaphor we have is kind of like a library, and we're sending people in and they're moving around. And this brings me to the point I wanted to make. We have these folk psychological notions because we have to remember that in our folk psychological context, we are not primarily interested in explaining phenomena. We're interested in primarily predicting and training. So, there's a language of explaining and a language of training. Now, here's what I want to say. If I want to train your memory, it's a really good thing to use that idea of a room. Right you see it on Sherlock, right? You have your memory palace or your mind palace, right? You have this room. It's called the method of loci. And let's say I'm going to talk to Andrew, and I'm going to first talk about rationality. So I get a room, like a space, maybe this house that I'm in, I'm familiar with, and the library is where I'm going to talk to Andrew about rationality. So I form an image of you in the library, and there's books and there's knowledge, and right. And then I'm next going to talk to, Andrew perhaps about transformation. Well, that's the kitchen, and I picture Andrew in the kitchen, and he's doing. And so what I do is I make all these images, and they're in different places. And what I do is I actually search. I go from room to room to room in my mind. And this is a powerful way to train memory. The ancient orators could use this technique to memorize speeches that would last like 6 hours. So it's a really powerful way to train your memory. And it goes very well with all those metaphors. The thing is, our memory doesn't work like that at all. That's good language for training it. But you don't actually have that sort of, serial search. Because, for example, can you please tell me Justin Bieber's phone number?
No,
you don't know. You don't know it.
Yeah.
No, you didn't scroll through all of your phone numbers and realize that it wasn't there.
Yeah.
You just know.
Is that like a heuristic or something, or?
Well, no. There's a heuristic. There's also a kind of parallel search. There's a kind of memory probably in neural networks as opposed to located memory like in standard computers. And your memories aren't stable. You're constantly reconstructing them. You're constantly rewriting them. That's why confident eyewitness testimony, 49% of it is inaccurate. 49% of it is wrong. Right? Because confidence measures how meaningful you find the experience, not how accurate it is. Right. Or we think, in a library, things that are, that are relevant to each other are stored close to each other. But like in your memory, if I say color, red, say another color as quickly as you can. So red.
Red.
Okay.
Oh, say another color.
Yeah. Ready. Blue. So red, blue. Okay. Now give me a word that rhymes with blue.
True.
Okay. So red is close to blue and blue is close to true. Is red close to true?
No.
But see, your memory. So although we talk about memory and we can train it with and it seems so intuitive to us that must be how memory works. Yeah. That's not how memory actually works. Do you see that? I'm trying to show you just in these sort of dog and pony examples that your memory doesn't actually work that way. In fact, it's taking us a long, and attention doesn't work just like a spotlight and all kinds of.
Yeah. So I'm jumping ahead to say that this is what you mean about wisdom too, right? Is seeing through self-deception, right? Well, or these forms can either lead to self-deception or they can lead to a greater understanding, depending how we use them or how transparent they are to us.
Right. So the what I'm trying to get at, yes, that's, I think, a very appropriate way of reframing what I'm saying. If we don't pay attention to the difference between our folk psychological language of training and our scientific language of explaining, we can equivocate, we can confuse them together, and thereby deeply deceive ourselves. Now, I think,
and get into all kinds of new age nonsense.
Well, in new age nonsense, but also we could fail to more powerfully even use our memory when we're studying for a test. So people think, well, the best way to study for a test is sort of read the material over and over again and rehearse it, because it's like sort of, writing over and over again on the same spot in the library to make it sort of deeper. But that's not the best way to try and study for a test, for example, because you're not actually using your memory for how it actually functions.
Oh, can I just do a slight aside here?
Yeah.
Because this is fascinating to me. I was talking to Zach Stein recently. Do you know Zach? Do you know?
Yeah, Zach and I have talked. Yes.
Yeah, he's a brilliant guy. Anyway,
totally. He
brilliant. Told me that that he's a high achieving dyslexic.
Yes.
And he described his mind, and it seemed to be very similar to mine. And I'm pretty sure that I have the same thing that he has. In other words, you read the paragraph first, and then you read the sentence, and then you read the word. You don't read from the word up to the paragraph. Like you're too in the gestalt, and then you have to get to the detail, to the feature, right? So an ordinary mind kind of, or most, I shouldn't say ordinary because nobody has an ordinary mind, but most people kind of build up from maybe the feature to the gestalt. And then a person who has that kind of dyslexia, it doesn't mean they can't read or anything. They just kind of do things in a different, different way.
It's a It's a little bit more complicated. Everybody,
I'm sure.
Everybody actually simultaneously, again, because you're not doing things step by step, the way we think in language.
Yeah.
So that's why we had to get neural networks to solve what's called the chicken and egg problem. Because when I'm reading, I need to read the letters in order to read the word, but I need to know what the word is in order to disambiguate the letters. So you're simultaneously going from feature to gestalt and gestalt to feature.
Sure.
Right. So it's in parallel, again, which is not something that's easy to put into words. Right. It doesn't go well with sort of, again, our folk psychological understanding of how we do things, but it's modeled well in neural networks, for example. Now, the thing is, of course, everybody's sort of doing that, but there is variation on like how it's skewed. Some people are more skewed featurally. Some people are more skewed gestalty, if you'll allow me. Rather weird.
Got it. Yeah.
So my main point of all of this, and thank you, because you've helped me sort of explicate my point right in this discussion we've just had, is we have to be willing to challenge our folk psychological notions of rationality. Because it's very plausible that, like all of our other folk psychological constructs, while it has some important truths to it, it also has a lot of misrepresentation and misdirection with respect to the phenomena. And so why that's a little bit more challenging for us, I think, is that, if you have sort of a memory that's not that great, it's a little bit affects your sort of status and your self-esteem a little bit, but not that much. But these terms, intelligence, rationality, and wisdom, they carry with them we identify with those aspects of our cognition very, very powerfully. So that's why people get very, very sort of about notions of intelligence, rationality, and wisdom. So again, we need to pull apart, right, our identification with these processes, which of course we should address eventually, but we need to pull that apart from our attempt to get our best understanding of them. Because again, just like a lot of our my side biases and our egocentric bias, our identification with these processes can actually deeply impede us getting a good understanding of them. I needed to say all of that precisely because I want to challenge two standard notions of what it is to be rational.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, so one notion of what rationality is, it's kind of the Spock version for those of you and I of that generation. We know, right, this idea that rationality is logicality, and you see this in there's a lot of sort of online forums that's the model of rationality. That rationality is to be as logical as possible, and Mr. Spock sort of exemplified that. And the problem with that is we have to set it into an overarching idea that ultimately we are goal directed. We're seeking goals. We're seeking to achieve goals. And so one thing we have to note is that what rationality means as a method for us is we're looking for the most reliable and systematic way of achieving our goals, right? So you say, wow, but that's fine. Logic is the most reliable and systematic way of achieving truth. The problem with that is it's not true. Not because logic isn't relevant to rationality, but you can't identify rationality with logic. And here's the problem. Logic works in terms of certainty and a completely formal system. And what that means, and I'm trying not to presuppose too much, be presumptuous of what people have seen of this series, but what that means is you're basically into a kind of processing that has to check all of the problem space. It has to check all of the information. It has to check all the possible options. You have to be comprehensive and exhaustive.
You have to be kind of like a machine of some kind, rather than
machine. But no machine can do that. Like even our best chess playing machines can't search all the possible options. It's combinatorial explosive. They can't search all of the the problem of search is still the profound problem. There's
just too much information.
Too much. So if you were, and everybody acknowledges this who is working within rationality, Herbert and Simon, I think was it Simon's book, I think, or was it Newell and Simon, or Simon's book, I think, Bounded Rationality, that rationality is always bounded in terms of what's actually possible for us. Cherniak talked about we're in the finitary predicament. And this goes to the core of my work. We can't reason, we can't make inferences on the basis of all possible options, all possible probability, like all possible information. That's combinatorially explosive. So what we do is we bound it. We zero in on what's salient. Here, you knew I was going to do this. And relevant to us, right? And so that means before you can even use logic, you have to have pre-logical processes of problem formulation, the direction of attention, searching memory. And those are not obstacles to being rational because they prevent you from being fully logical. They actually facilitate, they constitute you being a viable cognitive agent. If you don't have that, you're going to be the next task I try to perform, I'm going to hit combinatorial explosion, and then I've committed cognitive suicide.
So if we're dreaming or something like that, a dream is we don't normally think of a dream as being rational.
But it could be.
But it could have a rational function, or it could have a.
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Well, more than that. I mean, I think that what you see is one plausible account of what dreaming does is it's a kind of optimization process on how your brain is operating. And so it's not so much the content of the dream, but it's sort of the way in which your brain is sort of practicing getting better at adjusting what it finds salient and relevant. So it does weird variations on patterns that you've sort of acquired through the day, and it sees which one of those sort of optimize its ability to track and predict and solve problems. That's why you're often solving weird problems in your dreams, right?
Right, yeah.
Right, and so, and that looks all sort of crazy, it's all illogical, but it could turn out to be rational because it could be actually optimizing this process of relevance realization that is so central, especially, and here's what I want to come back, if it systematically and reliably improves your ability to zero in on relevant information, and then I'm going to add something to that that is directly implied by that, it systematically and reliably improves your ability to overcome self-deception, then I think that's how we should understand rationality. Rational practice is a practice that systematically and reliably improves your ability to overcome self-deception and to optimize your ability to zero in on the relevant information such that you are more and more capable of being a good general problem solver and achieving your goals. And that's what rationality means. So it's not logicality, but it's also not just being intelligent. Right? Because the problem with intelligence is basically, Leo and I argue this, Leo Ferrara and I argue this, and I think you can make a good case that a lot of people are implicitly arguing for this, that what we're measuring when we're measuring intelligence is we're measuring sort of your working memory capacity to zero in on relevant information. And the problem with that is, and this is the issue, right? Very often what I initially might find relevant or salient is actually a kind of bullshitting. It's actually taking me away, right, from being able to solve the particular problem. I'm paying attention to the wrong things because my machinery is designating certain things as relevant or salient that actually will not help me to zero in on or track the patterns that I need in order to find my goals, right? And this is where you need insight. Yeah. This is because when you have an aha experience, you realize, oh no, I formulated the problem the wrong way, and I've got to change what I find relevant and salient. And that means if we have an account of rationality in which insight does not play a central role, we do not have a good account of insight, because the machinery of insight is the machinery by which you optimize your ability to zero in on information, and it's the same machinery you use to overcome self-deception. So the problem with that, with the idea of it just being intelligent, is rationality. So intelligence is what you're using.
Well, there's a lot of, if I could just, there's a lot of very stupid, intelligent people, right?
Well, I would say
they have the machinery is all there, but they're not using it correctly, or
that's right.
They're not using it in a optimized way, or in a let's say ethical way, or in a
or a non-self-delusional way, right? Right? And so that's exactly my point, Andrew. You use your intelligence to solve your problems, but that can generate all kinds of skewed salience landscapes, capacities for acting immorally, for acting in a self-deceptive manner. Rationality is what you use in order to deal with all of that, right? All of those negative side effects generated by using your intelligence in an adaptive manner.
So rationality is a practice rather than something you're just born with. In other words,
no,
that's very important to think to know that, right? That it's something you work on, and it's. You said it was aspirational, right? It's something.
Yes.
You want to become a rational person, even though. It seems like an ideal, like it's not a very likely scenario that you would become 100% rational.
I don't even know if
that's possible.
I don't even know if that's the correct way to frame it. Because it brings with it a sense of an idea of completeness or finality. And because your because your intelligence is a self-organizing, evolving, dynamical system, and because the world is a self-organizing, dynamical system, there's no sort of final state you can get into where you can pronounce, now I am forever free from the problem.
So it's all process, sort of. It's all process.
Well, this is how I interpret the first noble truth of Buddhism. I'm not a Buddhist, but like, even though Alexander says I am, but but I interpret it as, not that all of life is suffering, because that makes no sense, but that no matter where you turn, there is no place in which you can be free from the threat of self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior, no matter how smart you are, no matter how intelligent you are.
Yeah, you'd always be missing something, wouldn't you? You'd always have a blind spot somewhere.
Or
you always have a lot of blind spots.
A lot of them. So, if you take a look, a lot of psychology is going through the replication crisis. Results are getting replicated. Well, you know what is robustly getting replicated time and time again? All this stuff about cognitive bias, all this stuff about self-deception, all this stuff about how intelligence is necessary but not sufficient for rationality. All of that is very, very robust. It is not going through the replication crisis. It's an aspect of our cognition that we should have very strong confidence in, which means, given these 2 points, we should not think of rationality as identical to either logicality or either to our intelligence, our sort of our innately given problem-solving capacity, because that's what I think intelligence is. And I think this would actually ameliorate a lot of useless debates. People don't like the idea that IQ is fixed, because then they think they're doomed, right? They think, no, right? Because, and then there's all these objections and this is, I think, this is an argument I get from Stanovich. We shouldn't be caring so much about intelligence. Yeah, G is a good predictor. It's one of our best. G is measures of general intelligence. Do you know what I really care about you? How rational you are. Yeah. Because that's going to predict how moral you behave, how you can overcome egocentrism, how you're less self-deceptive. You're more
What about the whole affective world, right? And all that. Because I was thinking about how when I was talking to Guy last night, he kind of lives in that kind of a realm. He's very rational as well, but he doesn't swim in rational arguments. He kind of swims in something else, or
well, but that's
but again, I guess I still have this narrow definition of rationality when I'm talking.
No, but that's great. What you just, that's a beautiful segue for me, because I've 2 ways in which the folk psychological notion is too narrow. It either and it often does it both in a contradictory manner, but it often identifies rationality with being intelligent, right, and therefore fixed like intelligence, but no, it's not. Rationality is not intelligence, and rationality is developmental. You can get better and better and better. You can aspire, and it's not equivalent to logicality. Just being good at logic is not. The evidence is clear. It does not make you very rational, actually. Rationality is about knowing where, when. It's about rationing. It's about knowing where, when, and to what degree to be logical. Now, what you just said brings me up to the 3rd way in the folk psychological notion. Ours, not cross-culturally, but ours in the West, is deficient, is we limit rationality to just inferential processes about belief. Right? We say, we limit it to use some of my terminology, we limit rationality to just propositional knowing, and that the sole goal of rationality is to get true beliefs, which of course is ridiculous. I could get an indefinitely large number of true beliefs in my room by noting correlations between how many paper clips are in the room and how many cups are in the room. Like the amount of information in this room, the amount of true information is overwhelming. What we actually want is true information that's relevant to us, relevant to our problem-solving tasks, relevant to our moral undertakings, etc.
Yeah, I was listening to somebody who was talking about intelligence. I put that in the article I write, and he said that wisdom is when you can say, "So what?" Like you can discard all that information, which is not important, and you can narrow in on what really matters. Like in a deep existential way, not on as you say, products or.
I mean, sometimes our goals are genuinely epistemic. We want to know the true causes of things. But, and this is the point I want to make, but if we bring in the many other ways in which we try to couple ourselves to reality, our procedural knowing, then we want systematically and reliable ways of getting and improving our skills. Our perspectival knowing, well, then we want systematically and reliable way of improving our salience landscaping and our ability to generate a sense of presence. Our participatory knowing, we want systematic and reliable ways of getting into the best kind of existential mode. For example, should I be in the having mode right now? Should I be in the being mode? Should I be treating you categorically? Should I be treating you individually? Like all of those kinds of things. And how am I appropriately set? And you see, and the thing about Guy is swimming. Right. First of all, relevance is not cold calculation. It's not logic. Relevance is about an act of commitment. I am committing my precious time and resources in a gamble, a risky gamble, that I care. I'm caring about this information rather than that information because I'm ultimately trying to take care of myself and take care of the.
Well, this word care seems very important because, one of the reasons some people would want to be transrational or have post-rational experiences or have experiences that were not what they would consider to be rational is because rationality often seems like a cold form of analysis. But you're saying exactly the opposite, right?
I'm saying exactly the opposite. So and this goes back to Socrates. So the Socratic Platonic tradition, right? All of this, this argumentative stuff, the inferential stuff, is bound up with also abilities to change perspective, to cultivate sophism, a kind of salience lens. That's what that's one of the cardinal virtues. We usually translate it very poorly as moderation, but it's much more like your salience landscaping has evolved so it spontaneously self-organizes to tempt you towards what is more true, towards what, right? It's basically your perspectival knowing has been trained so that you're much less subject to bullshit. Right. So
usually this is something you said in the series. Usually we're tempted to bullshit, but I like you say, what if we were tempted to the good or whatever that might be. Yeah.
And wouldn't that be part of what a wise person has? They would come into a situation, right. And before they're getting into perhaps any specific inferential processing, they're sort of drawn to not only what's relevant, but what's, in a problem-solving sense, but maybe what's also relevant in a moral sense, what needs to be addressed. You see, that's the thing about Socrates, right, and the Platonic tradition, right? All of that argumentative stuff is bound up with love. It's profoundly. So we see these, post-romantic tradition, we see these as love, spirituality is about love and science is about reason, and the two are opposed and they're separate. But no, in the whole Socratic, Neoplatonic tradition, they're bound up together. In fact, Socrates claimed to know ta erotica. He knew what to care about. He did. There were some things he actually did claim to know.
That's a good definition of wisdom, isn't it? To know what to care about.
Yes, to know. So he was seeking a rationality of appropriate caring, right? Now that caring can be caring for the truth. It can be also caring caring about what's right. It can be caring about what's beautiful. You see, and a lot of the Socratic dialogue is not about coming to an argumentative conclusion. It's about trying to bring in the perspectival and participatory knowing, right? And that's why Socrates often doesn't use analogies to argument. He often uses analogies to skills, because procedural knowledge is a little bit closer than propositional knowledge. to perspectival and participatory, right? And so you're bringing in the perspectival and the participatory knowing because you're trying to shape it. Again, often the dialogues don't end in any kind of inferential conclusion. They often leave you, well, we don't have any clear conclusion about what.
Well, maybe it's like I guess it's like good art or something. It doesn't.
Yes.
It doesn't wrap up the whole story, so you're satisfied with your product in like a Hollywood movie. It kind of opens a new vista for you.
It opens a new vista, and it also launches you onto aspirational transformation. So what you'll see at the end of a lot of these dialogues is there's no argumentative conclusion, but you'll see like there'll be like there's a dialogue on courage, and there's two people arguing, and it's interesting because they're arguing about courage, and they represent these two positions I'm talking about. There's a general, and he thinks just his common sense notion of what courage is, that's the correct. So
I've read that, yeah.
Right, he's full psychological. And then there's a guy who's a sophist, and he has this sort of technical, sort of logical definition, right, that he's heard from somebody else, right? And Socrates rejects both of those. And then you get to the end, and there's no conclusion as to what courage is, other than the fact that these two approaches have been shown to be inadequate. But what you see is both of the generals say they want their sons to come and learn from Socrates, to spend time with Socrates, because the process has them.
Because maybe perhaps courage is not something that you can define. It's something that it's not something you could define in any absolute sense.
No,
it kind of made me think about Heidegger and what he talked when he talked about thinking and how yes. Concepts. A true concept is something that doesn't have any kind of finitude to it. It just reveals itself more and more over time, more and more truth over time, and you can never pin it down. Or
that goes back to what I was saying earlier about you have to get away from models that seek completeness and being a finished thing. And I think that's exactly the right. So Socrates, the point of the dialogue is you have to step back, and this is why Plato writes dialogues as opposed to just straight arguments. The point is you can't get a definition of courage, but as you watch Socrates move between these two positions, the Scylla and Charybdis of going wrong, you get a sense of how to get on the track, how to aspire to courage, and that Socrates is reliably on it. So you develop a kind of trust in following Socrates because he has exemplified, even though he can't explicate, courage. So the idea that I would like to bring into a lot of current practices like Guy's circling is to not always just be participating in the process, but also to step back and look at what we're exemplifying in the process. So like, in circling, you're doing all these things to maintain the flow of the distributed cognition, and everybody's feeling that it's very meaningful. But whatever you step back and say, but what is meaning? What is meaning in this situation? And not just abstractly, because you've got the phenomenology, it's active, it's engaged, and you have multiple people there that have multiple perspectives on it. And you can start doing something like a Socratic dialogue. Well, what is it to be meaningfully connected? And then what you can do is check with, are we still exemplifying the phenomena we're trying to explicate? And you try to keep the two. You try to keep the two like tightly coupled together, so you don't. You're constantly moving. Chris Master Pietro and I talk about this in the chapter we wrote on Dialogos. You're constantly you're constantly moving, but in an integrated fashion between theory and theoria, between theorizing and then going back and really theoria, really
testing it out in the
really experiencing it in action. Right? And so rationality then would be for collective intelligence, would be to try and find systematic and reliable ways of getting that kind of pattern of communication and connection between people in place.
Very, very interesting. Yeah. It seems to me that that's very important now, especially because we're in a very anti-rational time or something. Right. Everything is about sensation and feeling, and I don't want to be say that feeling is bad, but everything is about everything is based on clicks and likes and
salience.
Experience and salience. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So that seems to be very important to yeah, okay, that, there's the ocean of experience, and then there's also stepping out and coming back in and going in and out of that.
I think it's very needed, and I would want to say that let's use the Socratic model we just had, and also the some of the points we've made. I think our time is irrational or lacking in rationality in two senses. In one sense, we're like the one general who just, let's go with my intuition and my impulse and whatever just sort of comes to me. And then we have, no, let's be rational. Let's be technical.
Oh yeah, exactly. Right. That's what I was going to say as well. I mean, what it's this hyper rationality, which is I
don't think it's rationality at all.
Which you would say is not rationality at all, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I still have the folk definition of rationality in my head, so it's almost hard for me to have the conversation until I've redefined the term rationality.
I completely understand.
You know what I mean?
And like I said, you're struggling against not only just sort of the familiarity of your folk psychological conception, you're also struggling against the fact that we have set up all these cultural patterns of identification and evaluation around these terms, right? And we reward people, and we claim this and we claim that. And that's also, I think, acting as an obstacle to trying to get back to a notion of rationality that actually starts to overlap with wisdom. You see, that's what these two, this notion of rationality is just being sort of, practical, intelligence, problem solving, or the notion of rationality is just being sort of good logicality. It tells me nothing about wisdom. Basically, it doesn't really help me. It doesn't help me with that systematic and reliable way of cutting through bullshit, getting to what's relevant, and then also aspiring, right? Properly aspiring so that my development is constantly evolving with reality in a sort of continuous coupling. None of that is given to me by those models.
So you talked to Ian McGilchrist recently.
Oh my gosh!
So I'm very interested because your story is almost the opposite of his, but you're probably saying the same thing. Because he talks about left brain, right brain. You talk about opponent processing, working together. Those seem to be kind of analogous. Whereas he says that rationality is just cutting the world up into bits and turning us into bureaucratic monsters. And we need to get more into the right brain world of feeling and or context and the lived experience, the embodied experience of life, and so how did your conversation go? How did you
we're going to talk again. It went so well. We really clicked really deeply. So Rebel Wisdom, they recorded it. It will be released at some point. So a couple points on that. First of all, because this goes to what we were talking about earlier, perhaps a more helpful way to think of right and left is to think, and I actually brought this up with Ian in person, and he said it was completely convergent with him. So I have good reason to believe I can speak sort of something that we are agreeing on, because I have in-person evidence, right? To think, so you can, because I came at it, I hadn't read Ian's work until about 2 weeks before I was going to meet him.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Because I came at this stuff and I came to similar conclusions from all the work I do on insight, right? Insight problem solving. So a good way to think about the right hemisphere is it works more in terms of the gestalt.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
And so it likes wide open attention, and it looks for it's sort of pursuing pattern completion, right? Whereas the left hemisphere is more featurely oriented, and it does things in a step-by-step manner. It's doing something more like running a program than trying to complete a pattern. It's sort of building features up step by step by step, right? And so think about the kind of attention it needs. It needs very narrow focused. It looks for clarity. For it doesn't like ambiguity. Now, it's
the folk idea of rationality would live in the left brain, but not the.
Well, and that's that's I think part of our Cartesian heritage. That's to identify rationality with analysis, and Mary Cohen has brought this point up. And I think to identify rationality with analysis is a mistake. I think well, for all the reasons I've already articulated, it truncates what rationality should mean. especially because rationality is about ratio, finding the patterns, rationing, right? Getting the proper context. It's a much more logistical notion. So why do we have these two? Well, the left hemisphere is very good for well-defined problems in which you have a really good representation of your initial state, your goal state, what actions and operations.
What you already know. It tells you what you already know about what you already know.
Yeah, it's familiar to you in a deep way. So a multiplication problem would be, for many people, a very well-defined familiar problem. Now, compare that to the problem of avoiding predation.
Yeah.
What does that look like? Well, I'm avoiding, what's my initial state? I'm not sure, right? Right.
You don't get a notepad and start to write.
You don't know what the goal state looks like, right? Very clearly. And this is the thing, Andrew. Most of our real world problems, this is why that notion of rationality of analysis is so limiting. Most of our real world problems are actually like the problem of predation. They are ill-defined problems. You and I are trying to have a good conversation right now. What's the initial condition? Well, we're not talking. That's not very helpful. What's the goal state look like? Well, I don't know. Does every good conversation look the same? No, they have some feature. What should I say? What should I do? Should I wave my hand? Should I raise my voice? Right? You see what I mean? Or go on a successful first date. Or tell a joke.
You can't draw a picture to tell somebody this is how you go on a successful first date. You can't go from A to B. Yeah.
You can't give a program.
There's no program.
Right, but you can't. That doesn't mean it's useless. There are ways we get better at going on dates. We get better at conversation. And think about that. Think about that. What I just said. How that goes back to what Socrates is doing in the dialogues. Right. You get better at becoming courageous. Right, but that doesn't mean I can give you a formula or a program for courage.
Yeah.
Right. Now, when I was talking to, like I said, so Ian makes a distinction. And it's kind of the reverse of the distinction I make. So I think it was largely semantic. He actually makes the distinction between rationality and reason.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's what I wanted to bring up.
And I picked up on that.
Since reason is great because reason is holistic and it's how you put everything together. And we should be reasonable, but we're overemphasizing rationality and cutting things into bits.
So here's what I can say then very clearly. I'm using rationality the way Ian uses reason.
Exactly.
And he's using reason, right? The way I use rationality, right?
Right.
What he rejects is what I consider to be that truncated folk psychological notion of rationality that I think does not represent anything that will help facilitate our aspiration towards wisdom. And so, although
there is a problem, maybe the problem I'm seeing is that notion of rationality is so deep. It's like
it's Cartesian. It's woven into the scientific worldview. It's woven into our epistemological models, and that worldview and those epistemological models get woven into our psychological models. They're woven into Freud. They're woven into Jung. They're woven into many. That's why Guy is so attracted to Heidegger, because Heidegger is like he's profoundly trying to break out of that whole Cartesian way of thinking about belief and truth and rationality, and he's trying, I think, to get us back to a way of understanding rationality. And
so maybe what he calls thinking is what you call rationality.
Totally.
What Heidegger calls thinking and what Ian McGilchrist calls reason.
Yes.
We're just having different semantic areas here.
Yes, I agree. I agree. So the argument that I have, sort of why I think rationality is actually an appropriate word, is reason tends to be associated with reasoning. But the problem with reason, it's equivocal. It can go to reasoning, which means inference and argument, or it can go to reasonable, which means this kind of thing we're talking about. So that's why I'm a little bit, whereas the etymological origin of rationality is ratio. It's finding proportion. It's putting things into proper relation. It's getting the proper perspective.
It's more about relationship.
Yeah, exactly. It's more about pattern completion than running a program to completion. Those are two very, very different things.
Also, we need to be unreasonable at times.
What do you mean by that? Because
we need to, as you say, break frame. right? So if we're trying to be reasonable all the time, if this is why there's shamanism. There were shamans and as you talked about in your series, break out of the 9-dot problem or.
Yep. So, but this brings me to an important point. I would want to say, because I actually have brought this argument up. I've presented at a couple conferences, this idea that disruptive strategies are actually important for optimization. In fact, they're systematically and reliably important for optimization. So if you're running a neural network, for example, and you just let it just sort of run, right, it'll overfit to the data. It'll find patterns in its sample and really pick up on those patterns in its sample that don't actually generalize to the population. This is sampling bias, right? And so, because the machines are so powerful and your brain is way more powerful than any neural network. So think about how you can really zero in, right, and get bound to, you can overfit to your particular sampling of data. So what do you do in the neural networks? Well, you actually disrupt the network. You shut off half the nodes, or you throw noise or static into the system. And what that does is it makes the neural network re-self-organize, right? And that re-self-organization actually allows it to now generalize in ways it couldn't generalize before. Yeah. So you have to throw disruption in.
Well, I recently done some Groff breathing techniques, things like that, and I don't do psychedelics, but that kind of experience it throws you into these wild sort of spaces, right?
Right, and it's
wild, and then you come out at the other side as if you've gone into Alice in Wonderland, and you come out the other side sort of like, and you have to reassemble your ordinary existence, and hopefully you've got some insight after doing that.
And what happens is your perspectival and participatory knowing have been shifted, and so a new course of development is actually available to you.
Yeah.
Think about like when you're in that space, it's like what happens in dreams. A lot of variations are being thrown at, like sort of generated. Options are being created that open up what's called the state space. It opens up the possibilities that your brain can actually get itself into. Like, so your brain is a machine that's constantly making itself into a new kind of machine. And you want to periodically, like with a neural network, you want to open up the options it can consider. Not only the options in the world it can consider, but the options for what kind of machine it can be. It's those two together at the same time, right? And so and you can see this even in insight problem solving. If I give you an insight and I moderately distract you, or even throw some static into the picture, some noise, that will actually help to trigger your insight.
Of course, yeah.
So
you get better at the game, right? If you're tripped up,
but you have to do it in the right way. It requires finesse, right? So there's a kind of expertise here. You have to do it in the right way, right? There's no formula, but you have to do it in the right way. But there are systematic and reliable ways of getting better at doing that disruption. Now, here's my argument. This disruption is really indispensable to optimization. There are systematic and reliable ways of doing that. Wouldn't that therefore be integral to our account of wisdom, that these disruptive processes? And that means that although they're non-inferential, they have actually no propositional content whatsoever, because they're basically...
zero propositional content, right?
But nevertheless, they move you towards a more optimal, that optimization of, I have more options in what kind of cognitive being I can be, and there are more options about what kind of world I can dwell within. And that is making you more rational.
Yeah. Well, again, it's counterintuitive. Yeah. Well, I guess the rational world that we live in often feels like a kind of prison, right? Because we're trapped in conceptual models of things. And that's one of the reasons why you would want to break frame or, do fasting or go out into nature and have all kinds of, let's say, of those kind of experiences.
Well, this brings me to another point. And I think Ian's bang on about the left and right stuff, but there's another opponent process that we need to bring into the discussion here, which is the relationship, because we're constantly toggling between being task-centered and mind-wandering, right? And the point of mind wandering, I would argue, at least one of its functions,
mind wandering, oh yeah,
is to break frame. It's to bring in some mild distraction, take you into a weird sort
that's
of
Guy again. Guy, sorry, I keep saying Guy because I'm in France, but I think that's what Guy does.
Well, see, Heidegger was about wandering. So what he's trying to do is, I think what Heidegger's doing is, if you just stay on the path, that's like the machine that's going to overfit, right? And what you need to do is you need to wander a bit, right? You need to go off, almost like in mind wandering. And what that does is allow you to, introduce some noise, introduce some variation, break some frame, but you keep moving forward, but you're now actually improving your connectedness to the world rather than just getting to your destination on your path.
Yeah. And that also speaks to the pathology of modernity, right? Is that we don't wander enough. We don't
wander enough. Hans says we don't.
We fill up the space too much with information.
Yeah, and salience, and we like that. That's why I also pointed out Hans' notion of lingering. It's not only that we fill up the space, well, take Heidegger, being in time, that your being is inherently temporal, right? And so your perspectival and participatory knowing of time, because you don't know time in any other way, right? Augustine famously said this: I know what time is until somebody asks me what it is, because, right, you only know time by being in time, right, by being a temporal thing. But so your existential mode with respect to time, how you're experiencing, that's the wrong word, but it's the only word I have, how you're participating, maybe let me use that word, how you're participating in time existentially has a huge impact on the kind of being you can be. And so Hans' point is, we are moving into a culture in which we can't linger, we can't flow with things. Everything is atomized. We're going down
just like minutes and seconds. Time is cut up.
That's exactly the idea.
Moments, yeah.
And so you don't get any flow. You get sort of the salient second, right? So a lot of people have talked to me about this, and we're seeing this consistent trend towards the death of melody in popular music, that we're losing melodic complexity, and that
we have this compressed sound all the time with MP3. This extreme compression of sound.
Extreme compression of sound, and salience and intensity are taking up the place of complexity and development. Right. Sure. So you don't have to follow a long piece of music and go through all kinds of transformation. You can instantly, without effort, get sort of hit by the salient
product, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so what that means for us is that, like I said, it's also that we can't linger, we can't stay with things in a way that affords us remembering the projects of aspiration.
Yeah, I think of going to the galleries. Like I live near Paris, and there's all these galleries, and how many people look at a painting?
Yes.
How many people go into it and actually just stay with the painting and look at the painting and find that a valuable experience, right?
Yes.
Most people would sort of look at the painting and take a snapshot of it with their iPhone and say, I've been there and I've seen that painting, but
that goes to just what I said. The point is to collect atoms, to collect moments that are atomized and are removed from a flow of development. They're just snapshots.
Okay. Yeah. Right? I think the remedy to that, one of the remedies I've seen is probably meditation in some sense, because for our modern times,
I think so.
Because it's how else can you because there's so much stimulus all the time. How else can you take a break from that? And
I think both meditation and contemplation are needed.
Sure.
Because you have to break frame and make frame. I think being able to enter into dialogos, to enter into a conversation.
That's a new thing for me. I've been meditating for years, but you and Guy, and that's a new kind of possibility for me. I hadn't really thought of that so much.
Well, I mean, this is part of the Platonic notion that training your rationality, in the sense I've been arguing for, and training your sociality are deeply interpenetrating things. That's why he presents his philosophy in a dialogue, because those two things, our ability to connect to distributed cognition and participate in collective intelligence and collective rationality, or dare I say it, collective wisdom, it's in resonance with our individual project of aspiring to rationality and wisdom. These two things mutually afford and depend on each other.
Awesome. Yeah. And also, I was just sort of thinking about how why this sort of conversation is compelling to people and stuff, which it's kind of a weird thing. It's like we're like homeless here or something. Yeah. I was saying that to Guy last night. It's like, we're putting in these videos on YouTube. It's not part of the mainstream culture. But there seems to be a need for that kind of thing.
Oh, totally. I think the online world, I mean, it has some of the greatest magnifiers of the things that exacerbate the meaning crisis.
Yeah.
But, Heidegger talks about where I think he's Holderline, he quotes, where the danger is, there also
right.
The future grows, I think it's a translation. I might have mistranslated. But the basic idea is, because it's destabilizing the system, it can be an affordance of the system going through self-transcendence rather than disintegration.
Or you could even say death and rebirth of some
kind of thing. Goes back to a shamanic kind of idea. And so what I think what's happening with Chris and I talk about the meta conversation. You have all these conversations, and then what YouTube is doing is setting up this thing where people are having conversations, but they're doing them with the awareness, right, and the connectivity to other conversations. So there's not only a dialogos within a conversation, there's this dialogos that's taking place between all of these conversations, and the way they constrain and impregnate and engender each other in this kind of complex self-organizing dynamic, which is really, really important. Because you see the same thing again, at least analogous in the Platonic dialogues. You shouldn't just ever read one Platonic dialogue. That's a mistake. You should read all of
it's an ecosystem again of
yes, exactly. All of the dialogues are speaking to and influencing and changing and affecting each other in powerful ways. And we're doing something analogous to that. Here's a dialogue, and then you've got one with Guy, and then they'll talk to each other and speak to each other in powerful ways.
That will inform me to speak to you, and then somebody else might get a little something out of this and bring it. Yeah.
Again, to bring a Socratic Platonic thing in, there's the possibility for anagoge. That's that reciprocal opening that you and I have talked about before. So a good conversation, when it moves into dialogos, you've got the reciprocal opening that's happening. And that, of course, is, again, a kind of love, right? Because when people get into reciprocal opening, they have the experience of the affective state. Love isn't an emotion; it's a higher order affective state, but it's an affective state, right, of love. And that's again how the rationality and the sociality and the love are all bound together. We should put them all back together.
Gotcha. Yeah, they're all sort of in little islands over here, and they need to come into one place.
Exactly. That's why I'm as critical of Romanticism as I am of empiricism, because both of them keep all of those things apart, but for different reasons, for different positions that they hold, and different epistemologies and metaphysics. And I think all of them are therefore equally at fault for keeping those things apart. Now, I mean, I'm doing a bit of a gloss.
Well, that was my other question. Actually, I wrote that down. It's like, what can we take from Romanticism? Because Romanticism is so powerful. It's so,
but that's the thing.
We need that, and on some level, especially in our, online world, people are so blasé and stuff. We need the. I don't know. I have a feeling that. That we need grander sort of experiences and emotions that we're being too polite and timid, and it's like being in a cage of some kind. And Romanticism is like trying to break that cage a little bit.
It is. I mean, So again, I was going to engage in some self-criticism, and you've actually allowed me to do so. So thank you for that. I mean, I try to make a distinction between what I call decadent romanticism, which is sort of our folk psychological version of romanticism in our
Sure.
culture, right? And sometimes I have not been careful enough about that, and so I do apologize to people, because you have to take a look at, like, just like I don't think you should talk about postmodernism in like
Sure.
You should zero in on particular thinkers and particular arguments, because there's variation, and so here's what I want to say. And especially I don't even know I want to call them romantics. The early the early post-Kantians like Schlegel and people like that, I think are actually saying things remarkably similar to what I'm trying to argue for. But the romanticism that you get, especially Rousseau's version of romanticism, which is a prototypical version of it, is the thing about romanticism, and I want to say this, I want to try and convey something, and I'm going to say it carefully and hopefully provocatively. It's closer to the truth than empiricism, and therefore it's more dangerous. It's more dangerous.
Is that because it's not contained in?
It's because
it's not contained in a collective experience. It's sort of
okay. There's that. So you've got Rousseau's glorification of individual subjectivity.
Okay.
That's clearly in Rousseau, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he does have stuff about the general will, but when we're talking about how he's a father of romanticism, the glorification of individual subjectivity is there. The idea that you come with a true self that you must be true to, which is antithetical to the idea of aspiration. So it's antithetical to the Socratic ideal of aspiration. The idea that this subjectivity should be thought of. So how am I trying to? When Rousseau's talking about it, he does not express enough worry about the problem of self-deception, sort of separating all of this from rationality, as I've tried to describe it, right? The Socratic notion of overcoming the ways in which we deceive ourselves and bullshit ourselves. Yeah. This exploration and expression of your individual subjectivity and your capacity through imagination and will for imposing an order on the world. Well, think about how that could just be filled with self-deception. Right, like projection and bias and prejudice, like all of those things, right? And so romanticism it's separated itself off from deep concerns about the human proclivity for self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior, which is why we get the almost the romantic trope of how living romantically ultimately is kind of self-destructive of the people who try to live that way. You can see that in sort of Wuthering Heights kind of stuff, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. My mother read that book like 20 times. It's like that's so appealing to people. I guess there's a self destructive element in that, or
there can
also a hatred of civilization, or a hatred of our efforts to build things and
so there is a lot of, so it was a terrific, and I want to catch both senses of that word. It was a terrific strategy for breaking the frame of empiricist enlightenment, for breaking the frame that John Locke gave us of the tabula rasa mind, and the world imposes itself and the finger of the world writes on my mind. It was a great counteractive to that. But I think it generates its own frame that needs to be broken and broken beyond.
Oh, that's well said. Yeah, that's great.
That's why Heidegger is so interested in being, because and in challenging the idea that we should impose our will on the world, right? That the world is just a standing reserve, because part of what Heidegger is trying to get us to remember is, Locke has the mind as a blank slate, but Rousseau has the world as a blank canvas upon which we paint our subjectivity. And Heidegger is trying to get us to remember, no, it's not a blank canvas, it's a world. It is deep and profound and beyond us.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's great. And it discloses itself,
as it will. Physis. I've heard two pronunciations, and I keep getting corrected by both camps on how I should pronounce the Greek term. I was in my intellect in my undergrad. Everybody pronounced it as physis, but I've now been told no, it's not, more like physis or physis or something, or physis, right?
That's the word disclosure in Heidegger.
Well, it's the word that we get physics from, but it means the way in which nature blossoms from itself, blooms from itself, but also the way in which nature loves to hide itself.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Heidegger is another subject. Yeah,
Yeah, and I mean, I'm having excellent conversations with Johannes about this, and I think it's up on his channel. I'm going to put up the dialogue that I had with him. Excellent. We're going to have and he and Guy and I are going to talk shortly about sort of Heidegger. But I'm going to put up the dialogue I had with Johannes. I'm doing a couple new series, right? I'm doing the Minding Media series, but I'm also doing this series. I haven't titled it yet, but what I'm trying to exemplify dialectic, which is the psychotechnology of engendering dialogos. I'm trying to exemplify that and get into these discussions where we're exemplifying and explicating what does spirituality mean within the scientific worldview and the meaning crisis. What does that mean for us?
Right.
And we had an excellent conversation on Heidegger and science and technology.
Yeah, I loved it. I saw about half of it, and I
it's up on his channel, I guess. Yeah. I'm going to release it on mine later.
The other, do you think you've said what you wanted to say about wisdom and rationality and intelligence? Is there any loose ends here?
Yeah, I want to say one more thing about sort of clarifying a bit the relationship between wisdom and rationality. I think that we should think of ecologies of practices for each one of the kinds of knowing that make us more rational. So, ecologies of practices for propositional knowing, ecologies of practices for procedural knowing, ecologies of practices for perspectival and participatory. So
do you have some examples?
Well, I think the ecology of practice for propositional knowing, we've got. I mean, that's what we think we know what we're talking about when we use this term I'm going to use. But if you do any philosophy around this, we don't actually know what we mean. And this is the term science. Science is whole ecology of practices, and it's bound up with history, right? And it's this way of trying to get to be as rational as we can, because the scientific method, it's actually a family of methods, is not about coming to certain conclusions. It's about really trying to reduce the influence of self-deception on our inferential processes and our propositional knowing. That's what actually is going on. The science is largely about trying to set things up so that we can break through our patterns of self-deception, right? Now, you have similar things, right, in your procedural knowing. And this is where, I think the martial arts traditions give us fantastic examples of how to cultivate ecologies of practices. And this is where Rafe Kelly is just doing some amazing and important work, right, on this kind of thing. Not right. The way he's using parkour and integrating it with martial art practice and mindfulness. Go and see some of his videos, see some of the dialogues I've had with him. The perspectival knowing, well, that of course, that's where all the stuff on attention and awareness, the mindfulness practices, right, the flow induction practices are really important. And the participatory knowing, that's where the dialogos.
That's what this is.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Participatory knowing.
We're trying to alter not just our thoughts, but our identities, the way in which we're mutually shaping each other, the way us and the world are engaging. So I'm entering into reciprocal opening with you, but together we're also trying to enter into reciprocal opening with the world, right? And so, yeah.
Great.
So here's my point. Let's say there are systematic and reliable kinds of rationality for each of the kinds of knowing. There's propositional rationality, procedural rationality, perspectival rationality, and participatory. Then you need something that optimizes the relationship between all of those rationalities. That's wisdom.
Hmm. So wisdom is about the relationship. It's about between all. It's kind of the whole, or the.
Yep.
Okay, I see.
It's wisdom is very much a kind of meta rationality, right?
Yeah.
At least that's how I would argue. And I think that it's not identical to what.
Is that like gnosis? The word gnosis came to me. Is that?
I tend to think of each one of them. I tend to think of episteme for propositional, techne for procedural, noesis for perspectival, and gnosis for participatory. And then I think Sophia and phronesis describe the two aspects of wisdom. The bottom-up aspect, that's phronesis, and the top-down aspect. So when I'm coordinating those four kinds of knowing, I need a lot of bottom-up, and I need a lot of top-down. I need phronesis, and I need Sophia.
Awesome. Wow, that's a whole structure you've.
It goes towards the work I'm doing with Daniel Craig on the cognitive continuum. By the way, I just want to mention I have an Indiegogo campaign and I'm not getting any money from that campaign or from the book. The money is, I'm a university professor. I get a salary. I'm fine. Daniel is a student, and he's committing to working on this book with me. And it's not just writing; he's generating art. He's basically like the movie producer as well as a co-author. So this money is to help to support him as he's doing all of this work. But what we're talking about in the cognitive continuum is exactly this, because I think, and I try to argue that in the series, I think we can get also, instead of building a mystique around these terms, and this is where like Evan Thompson's work I think is really important. Also Stephen Batchelor, both of them are now post-Buddhists, because they object to Buddhist exceptionalism, the idea that Buddhism is somehow a special or privileged religion compared to all the rest because it's somehow scientific. And I agree with you.
Yeah, I object to that as well.
I knew you would. And you have to remember that both Stephen, and I know I have met Stephen, had dinner with him, and Evan is a colleague and friend of mine. They're both deep friends of Buddhism. These are not hostile things outside, right? And so, they point to the fact that what's happened is this, let's take a term like enlightenment. It's bound up with entire cultural projects and worldviews, and it often has this mystique around it. I remember, let me tell you how this frustrates me. I've asked Buddhists, how many people in the world do you think are enlightened right now? And they'll say, well, probably no one. And then it's sort of in my mind to go, well, what the heck is it for then? Right? I mean, the term is meaningless, right? And so I think instead, just like I tried to, if you'll allow me, I tried to reverse engineer wisdom. I tried to build it up out of, right? And in terms of what we want it to do and how I think we should do the same thing with enlightenment. I think enlightenment is, we should reverse engineer it.
Oh, it's a terrible word, isn't it? It's
a terrible word. And what I think we should do is, right, this is how I want to use the word. And maybe we should use a different word because of the critiques that Stephen and especially Evan are making. But I want so once I have wisdom, the two are going to be bound together. I want a wise ecology of practices that helps me transform cognition, consciousness, character, and communitas so that I can systematically and reliably overcome the perennial problems of self-deception and self-destruction, and afford enhancing all of the connections, what I call religio, that are so constitutive of meaning in life. For me, that's enlightenment. Because if it has to be some other deep metaphysical thing, I don't care, because I want to be able to help people alleviate the suffering of the perennial problems and afford the flourishing of enhanced connectivity to themselves, to each other, and the world.
Yeah. So you want to stay within the real, I guess.
I want to, and I'm going to stipulate how I'm going to use the term. And I'm saying I'm not using it ambiguously. I'm trying to not use it in a way that is loaded into a particular. I can't be completely free of a cultural worldview, but I'm not trying to bind it to a particular cultural tradition. Instead, I'm trying to pick up on what science gives us access to, is universal features and principles of our cognition, and then build a notion that is pragmatically engineered for a specific set of badly and widely needed goals.
Yeah. So I guess the reason this term is so offensive is that I was just thinking that it implies an end product or something.
So I'm deeply critical of that. I'm deeply critical of sort of the perfection, completion aspects of the term enlightenment. I'm deeply critical of the people refuse to acknowledge that they're sliding between something that's explaining the world and something that's evaluating the world, right? It's to use sort of technical language, and this is one of Evan's criticisms. Like you don't want to confuse your best description of how reality is with your best sort of normative claims about how things should be. Those aren't the same. And so, for example, why does that matter? Well, science isn't doing that second thing. Science is not in the project of this is the way things should be. This is this is moral excellence. This is aesthetic excellence. Science isn't it doesn't have the machinery for doing that. Science is about trying to give the best explanations. It doesn't really afford us in our aspirational projects. And so I think Buddhism is an aspirational project, and therefore to pretend that it's sort of it's also deeply scientific. That's a category mistake.
Yeah, it's a category mistake for sure. It's not, science is one way of knowing, right? And then Buddhism might be another. I would say.
And I think Buddhism addresses something that science doesn't address, which is aspirational project of transformation and self-transcendence. And that it's going to have a historical cultural aspect to it, right?
Yeah.
So I think what we should do, what we're trying to do, what Daniel and I are trying to do is, well, let's look at different cultural models, and then let's look at this pragmatically engineering sense of enlightenment that I've just given you, and let's put them into dialogue and try and get some convergent thing that maybe has less of the off-putting mystique of a lot of, because when you talk to people about enlightenment, it verges on the supernatural, and the person is becoming godlike. And it's like, well, if that's what it is, then, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to Buddhists, but I'm not interested in that. I'm really not interested in
godlike people
yeah. I mean, I'm interested. I'm interested in the aspiration to becoming more and more at one with sort of the sacred depths of reality. But that's very different from...
That's a question of growth, not a question of some ultimate state, or...
Yes, some ultimate state and some ultimate transhuman state. So there's a bit of a Nietzschean critique in my head here about you should be overcoming yourself, but you should never be abandoning your humanity in that project. So
I see. Yeah.
I guess I'm going to say something a little bit provocative here. I find humanity ultimately good enough. This is why I love Conrad so much. The Heart of Darkness. You compare Marlowe and Kurtz. Kurtz takes on the hubristic task of becoming a god, right? And then he suffers the horror. Marlowe makes conscious decision to exercise restraint and stay with his humanity, right? That he will not, even though he'll follow the journey, he'll go all the way to seeing Kurtz, he will never abandon his humanity. That's why the Heart of Darkness, I think, is such a powerfully important myth.
Well, that seems to be the bodhisattva vow, if I'm defending Buddhism a little bit.
Okay, sure.
Is to do just that, isn't it? It's not to accept.
Yeah. I think the bodhisattva, it might have been a bit of a corrective then in Mahayana for Theravada, because the bodhisattva is therefore much more different than the arhat in some ways. Yeah, that's a good thought. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, because there's a commitment to staying with humanity.
Yeah.
Okay, so
and that every being is they call it mother being. It's like every being is your mother, and you have to liberate every being. It's a wild sort of idea, but it's a sort of wild heroic idea that's
it's
not very rational, certainly, or not.
Well, I think it's rational in the way I would say.
It is rational. Here we go again. It's just I can't get the folk rational idea out of my head.
But I like that.
I'm sorry.
As a way of deeply binding the Enlightenment project to humanity. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point, Andrew. That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that.